Welcome everyone to this Bright Blue event in partnership with Cadent Gas. Thank you for getting here bright and early. This event is titled Green Gas, Making the Hydrogen Economy a Reality. In case you haven't heard of Bright Blue is an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. If you're going to talk about this event online, can you please tweet using the hashtags BrightBlue and CPC22 and to follow us at WeAreBrightBlue. So as I mentioned, this event is about hydrogen. So we have a couple of key questions that we're going to answer. I'm not going to run through them all, but just some of the ones that stand out. What more could the government be doing to further facilitate the transition to hydrogen? What changes are needed to the UK's physical and human capital for the transition to the hydrogen economy? And how will the relevant economic sectors overcome unique barriers to greater rollout of hydrogen energy? So the way this is going to be structured, we have a lovely panel here. Each of them are going to give short 5-minute speeches, and then we're going to open it up to the floor for a Q&A. When you do ask your question, there will be a microphone moving around. I know it's quite a small room, but it's just so the live stream can pick up the question for the people watching at home. And anyone watching the live stream can submit questions via the Slido link, or I think in the YouTube comments next to the stream. So first to introduce our panel, so immediately to my right is Andy Carter MP, who is the Conservative MP for Warrington South, and a member of the APPG on hydrogen. Immediately to my left is Clare Jackson, who is the Chief Executive of Hydrogen UK and the Head of Innovation and Low Carbon at GemServe. To my right next to Andy is Zoe Guijarro, who is the Principal Policy Manager at Citizens Advice. All the way to my left is Professor John Irvine, who is the Professor of Chemistry at the University of St Andrews and the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Physics Energy. And then finally, all the way to my right is Dr. Tony Ballance, who is the Chief Strategy and Regulation Officer at Cadent Gas. And then finally, I'm Joshua Marks, a Senior Researcher at Bright Blue. So I'm first going to immediately hand it over to Andy for a short speech.
Thank you very much. Congratulations on getting here. I'm amazed that there's almost a full room at 8:15. And apologies if my voice croaks. It's nothing to do with what I drank last night. I promise you, it's pre-conference flu, which I'm sure I will pass on to everybody so you can all have post-conference flu, as is a tradition. I knew, when I became an MP in 2019, I knew nothing about hydrogen. Well, I knew a little bit about it because I did chemistry at school, but you know, my business life prior to becoming an MP had been based in the media, running media companies, and the experience that you get when you become an MP is within a few days, about 1 million people send you an email saying, here's a great idea, would you support it? And I remember an email coming in from Cadent and from Northwest business leaders saying, here's a brilliant idea. We want to transition some of the biggest polluters in your region, in the Northwest, off what they've been using to heat their ovens and their furnaces onto hydrogen, and we want to tackle some of the big problems that we know are really prevalent in manufacturing by capturing the carbon and sticking it under the sea. And I read this and thought, well, that's a bit different, right? We'll have a look at that one. And I met with the team from Northwest Business Leaders and some of the team from HyNet, who showed me a pathway to where they were going with hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, and said we need somebody to champion this. I think I probably foolishly said, all right, let's have a look. Let's see where we go. And my first experience was going to a beverage recycling centre in Latchford in Warrington, which is right in the heart of my constituency. And I have to be honest with you, I didn't even know it was there because it's surrounded by conifers. Somebody planted some conifers, I think 10 years ago, and blimey, they've grown. But it is a site that I think is now certainly the UK's largest, but probably one of Europe's largest can recycling centres, right in the town centre of Warrington. And there are 2 big chimneys that sort of stick out that give it all away. And the other bit that gives it away is once these lovely empty drink cans have come in, every day at about 5 o'clock there are 7 or 8 ginormous lorries that leave with ingots on the back of them that are heading off to Jaguar Land Rover. The cans that have been delivered are recycled into Jaguar Land Rovers. And I spent time looking around this site thinking, okay, well, how is this hydrogen project going to really impact this business here? And the first experience of going into the ginormous warehouses or what turned out to be furnaces was my experience of the heat hitting me. And the gas being used in there to power these furnaces, to melt down all of these cans and to transition them into new cars. And the conversation I had there was genuinely revelationary. It was an experience that I think I took away and thought, this is what we can do. And the message I took away from there is, it doesn't matter how much we want to talk about decarbonisation of our economy, and however many light bulbs we can convince consumers to change in their houses, the bit that's going to really make a difference is tackling industry, heavy industry. And if we can get that right, if we can tackle that early on and get that right, we are in with a chance of achieving some of the things that the government want to achieve with net zero going forward. And so, the process of starting to convince ministers, to convince government that hydrogen in the northwest of England and a carbon capture storage system through HyNet began. We've worked, I think, in a collaborative way with business and with parliamentarians, and a cross-party way as well. And I have to say, I've learnt a tremendous amount as an MP in this sector over the last couple of years. But I think we've made some really, really good progress. And I think we're at the starting point. It feels like we've been at the starting point for 3 years, but genuinely, I think now we're at the starting point of things beginning to happen. And not only have I now managed to get my head around cans being recycled in Warrington, I've been to the glass factory that also bottles but makes the glass just down the road, and seen the furnaces there that can be transferred into hydrogen. Been to the cement factory in North Wales that can be transferred, and we can capture more carbon there. And the steps that we're taking now with business and with government support, £70 million of government support to make this a reality, I think are really fundamental. The greatest challenge I think that this sector faces, though, is the lack of knowledge that the general public have. And that's the bit that I spend most of my time now dealing with, from consumers in my constituency, but also engaging with other parliamentarians who ask very similar questions. First question they always ask is this safe? And the amount of times I write on my Facebook page about hydrogen, and within a couple of minutes there are 100 comments underneath from everybody that knows everything about hydrogen saying how it's all going to explode. And I spend time trying to correct people on what's actually... So I think probably for me, one of the first things government have got to do is actually have a really, really clear campaign on why hydrogen is a really, really viable option in terms of going forward, not just for tackling issues in industry, but also for putting into people's homes with a blended gas going forward as well. And I'm really excited that we've got some trials coming up in the northwest where we can put hydrogen into people's homes and see the benefits that families will get with that. I think we're in a good place, and I won't say this very often. I think we're in a good place that energy security is right at the top of the agenda, and hydrogen as an alternative is a fundamental that we can look at and capitalise on. So really pleased from that perspective. But my message to government at the moment is, let's go faster. Let's be even more committed than you have been, because business is ready, consumers want to engage, and now is the time that we can really drive this forward and make this a reality. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. I actually have one follow-up question before I want to move out. So you mentioned constituents, are concerned about it. Has that been a very recent change, driven by the cost of living crisis, trying to find alternatives? Or do you think that's sort of been a slow process over the last, decade, 5 years maybe?
I think, the general public just don't know anything about it. They don't know what hydrogen is. They might have heard the occasional mention of it. And, every now and again, I hear people say, why are we putting batteries into cars? Why don't we just go down the hydrogen route? And, if you say that in a room full of 100 people, 95 of them will look at you and say, well, what does that mean? People just don't understand at the moment. We've got a job on to really demonstrate and tell people the opportunity that exists with hydrogen in a way that we haven't done so far. And I think it's a really exciting prospect, and I think the government can really champion this. And everything I hear from the government, I'm really encouraged by at the moment.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Clare now.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much for having me. I think the last time Andy and I were sat around the same table, someone had given me an honorary doctorate on my label there. I'm slightly disappointed I haven't had that today. But yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Clare. I'm from Hydrogen UK. We are the industry association, which means that we bring together all the companies that are super excited about the hydrogen opportunity, even more excited possibly than Andy, if that's possible. But yeah, so I just basically wanted to give you 3 reasons today why we're at a really important juncture in the sort of hydrogen story, and why pace is really, really important at the moment. So the first is, I guess, to build on a little bit of what Andy was saying there. There are areas of our economy right now which, without hydrogen, we will be unable to provide affordable, clean energy for the future. Some areas which you just simply cannot electrify. So some of these are heavy duty transport, so things like maritime or aviation or trucks. And also, as Andy was sort of very astutely outlining there, parts of our heavy industries. And the reason why this is particularly important in terms of pace at the moment is for 2 reasons. The first is because there's increasing pressure on our industries to decarbonize. A classic example of this is the glass industry that's making glass for the automotive industry. And there's a huge demand for that glass now to be lower carbon product. The auto industry wants a lower carbon product. And if we cannot provide low carbon hydrogen to our glass industries, they will go somewhere else. They will go somewhere that can. And similarly, if we can provide an area where low carbon hydrogen is available, we suddenly become a very competitive industrial centre. So if we want to protect and grow our industrial heartlands in the UK, then low carbon hydrogen is absolutely essential to that. And the person that ends up going first is the person who wins in this area. And the second reason is because we're going to need an awful lot of hydrogen. Depending on what flavour you like your models, we're probably going to need roughly about the same amount of hydrogen as our power domain currently uses today. So that sort of size of energy, the size of our power domain is what we're going to need to build in the hydrogen industry, and that takes time. These are big projects. This is a big task that is facing us, and we have a reasonably short window to deliver it. So we need to get moving. Every sort of day, every month, every year that we delay, the risk and the cost of delivering that becomes higher. So that's number one, because we need a lot of hydrogen and there's areas that we can't decarbonise without it. The second is because, unless you've been living under a rock, you might have noticed we're in the middle of an energy security crisis, which means that we need to very urgently start to deploy a lot more domestic renewable energy. And we can't really do that without hydrogen. I'll explain why. The reason for that is that sort of currently in the UK, last year I think we spent 1.5 billion on balancing our grid. That's about 3 times more than the sort of 3-year average of the 3 years before. If we continue to deploy renewables, that cost will go up, and the economics of deploying more renewables becomes increasingly challenging the more that we do it, unless we deploy hydrogen alongside it, where we can use hydrogen as that storage vector that will enable us to improve the economics of renewables, enable us to continue to deploy domestic renewables at a time when it's absolutely essential that we do that. Sort of alongside that, in the sort of the vein of trying to keep the lights on, we have the system resilience angle as well, and looking at our infrastructure. And it's really important that we do electrification and hydrogen alongside each other to support those 2 infrastructures. We currently move roughly sort of about 4 times more energy through our pipes than we do our pylons. So we know that we're going to need to do electrification. We know that we're going to need to reinforce that infrastructure. If we can use hydrogen, we can start to reduce some of that pressure in our infrastructure, creating a more resilient energy system. And the third reason is because hydrogen offers this absolutely insane economic opportunity. This is an absolutely incredible growth sector. It's in its nascent stages at the moment. It's estimated that the hydrogen industry will be worth 2.5 trillion by 2050. That's a big number, supporting millions of jobs. And we want to make sure that the UK emerges as a global leader and we get a nice slice of that pie. But that will only happen if we are a first mover and we invest now. I want to encourage you that we're in a great position in the UK. We have some of the most exciting projects that there are anywhere globally right here in the UK. But at the moment, the vast majority of those are ideas on paper rather than projects that are actually delivering. And we need to get them from ideas to actually operational projects. And the reason why this is a really time-sensitive moment is the UK's put together a really competitive support package to support those first projects to get off the ground. But we've not yet pulled the trigger on it. That funding and that support is not yet actually available. And we've started to see some other countries start to catch up and start to put some very aggressive policies in place. So if we look at the US, the recently announced Inflation Reduction Act, which I have to refrain from calling the IRA because that gets a little bit confusing for people, where they put an incredibly competitive tax regime in place, which makes the US a really attractive place to invest in hydrogen. And similarly, our friends across the channel in Germany and France are also putting a lot of funding on the table. And if we don't do the same in the UK, the investment will go elsewhere. The investment at the moment is a decent chunk that is earmarked for the UK, but if we are not competitive, if we don't follow through with those policies and regulations that we sort of put in place, then the investment will go elsewhere. So I guess a massive encouragement that we are in a really, really strong foundation. We've got a really good opportunity to emerge as a global leader, but we really need to pull the trigger on the hydrogen industry and get moving.
Great, thank you. Some really interesting comments there about the need for pace, being the first mover, and sort of hydrogen's role not only in just sort of affordability for industries that can't be electrified and sort of grid resilience, and sort of how do we prep that as we electrify continuing in the future. I'm going to pass it over to Zoe now.
Thank you. I'm Zoe Guijarro from Citizens Advice. We are the statutory watchdog for consumers in the energy market. So my focus today is going to be looking at domestic heating, the role for hydrogen in domestic heating and the impact on people in their homes. So we're doing quite a lot of research with consumers around low carbon technologies in their homes just in general. And people tend to focus on the outcomes that those technologies can give them rather than the actual heating system itself or other technologies. And what people tell us that they want is a warm and comfortable home that's affordable to run and the heating system is reliant and responsive. That being said, when it comes to hydrogen, Citizens Advice do have some concerns. The extent to which hydrogen is going to be required for heating and hot water is by no means clear at this moment in time, and the reason that's really important is around the cost. In terms of heating and hot water, you need to have these things at scale in order to drive down the cost. So looking at hydrogen-ready boilers, for example. Now we know that they can be delivered at the same cost as a gas boiler, however, only if you're meeting the same level of demand as we currently see with gas boilers, which is about 1 million a year going into people's homes. So I think there's more work to be done about where hydrogen needs to go to be the most cost effective and to help deliver net zero. So I think we need a lot more clarity around that. Whatever heating system you have, energy efficiency absolutely has to be the first step. And I think if people have been at this conference the whole time, you'll have seen energy efficiency as a really strong vein running through it all. And we really think that there needs to be a much more large-scale effective rollout for energy efficiency, especially not only in a cost of living crisis, but again, that would help drive down costs of any technology going in to heat people's homes. And just to give you an example of how important that cost is at the moment, 147,000 people had contacted Citizens Advice up until August of this year around energy concerns. That is the same amount as contacted us last year. 55,000 people contacted us up to the 21st of September around energy debt. That's a 94% increase on last year alone. So we've got a real opportunity to get this right and to get the groundwork in around energy efficiency. And that's not just for the most vulnerable people in our society. We are getting contacted by people who are just about managing. So they're just about managing to pay their bills, but there's no extra flex in their budget whatsoever. And I just wanted to pick up on something that Andy said quite rightly around communication. Whatever route we go down, hydrogen, electrification, and I think we all know that it's going to be a mixture. Communication with consumers is going to be critical. One thing that's missing around this net zero transition is that high level communication campaign, letting people know this is coming. 29 million homes will need to have alterations, whether that's energy efficiency and low carbon heating. So we really need to start having that conversation with people. And finally, we definitely need to make sure that the right consumer protections are in place for this brave new energy world, to make sure, again, to answer Andy's questions around people wondering if things are going to blow up, or what to do if their heat pump's been installed the wrong way round, which we have heard of. So we need to make sure that, you know, people are communicated with, they get access to independent advice that they can trust, and that they are protected, whatever technology it is that goes into people's homes. I'll leave it there and
Good,
look
thank
forward to the discussion.
Thank you. I have one follow-up question actually before I move on. So you touched on it a little bit, but in general at these sort of discussions a lot of the time we talk about supply and how do we increase supply of hydrogen. But obviously the other side of that is demand. And when people are struggling, it's obviously not particularly helpful for them to ring up being, I'm struggling with my bills, and you go, I'll just use less energy. That's not really helpful. Do you think there is a role for reducing demand in people's homes? Do you think there's a way you could make that politically salient, you know, when people ring up rather than just telling them to use their subs, obviously not what they want to hear? Do you think there is a role for that, or how do we manage that sort of discussion?
Yeah, I mean, it has to go alongside a rollout of energy efficiency. Telling people to use less only works in a well-insulated home. I guarantee everyone's going to be using less this winter, and some people will be going cold because they won't be able to afford to turn the heating on. We have to focus on getting homes as well-insulated as we can to drive down that demand.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And now I'll pass it over to John.
Okay, I'm John Irvine from the University of St Andrews. I lead or have led national programs in hydrogen fuel cells and batteries. I also helped set up the Scottish Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association, a trade body, the largest trade body association in the world actually, about 15 years ago. So I really believe in, very keen to do the research, but also it's really important to get out there and show that it works and demonstrate. I also lead the Hydrogen Accelerator for Transport Scotland, and I actually own a train, a hydrogen train. So ScotRail were selling us a train to do a demonstration on, and it was £1, so before Christmas, so I put my name in the logbook rather than ask the university whether we should go on it. So officially I own a working hydrogen train, but it won't go very far or very fast. Okay, first thing I want to address is net zero. I mean, it's a wonderful aspiration. It's really focused the world, but it should not be taken as an excuse not to do things now. We really need to act now. Every gram of carbon we save today is going to make life so much better for the future. Also, what does net zero mean? It's really got to be net zero in a total global sense, not within our borders. You know, are we importing soya to feed chickens with taking down Amazon rainforest? That's not really net zero. And electric vehicles will probably never be net zero compared to internal combustion engines. At best, it's about 10% of the carbon footprint. So you really need to do stuff that's carbon negative, whether that's industrially utilising the carbon that's produced from cement, or better farming. We need to reverse the carbon. I'm also going to admit to being colour prejudiced, so I'm very pleased that you've asked me for this. I'm very strongly in favour of green renewables. I look out into the Firth Forth, and there's 750 megawatts of electricity being produced that we don't need. We've got to do stuff with it, and hydrogen is definitely an example. Grey hydrogen is reformed methane with lots of CO2 emissions, and we want to avoid that. Blue is grey with CO2 capture, and purple, which you may not have heard of, cracks methane to form carbon. There's a lot of slippage underneath it. Now, blue needs to be done really well, and that is expensive. You can't do blue hydrogen badly. It doesn't really help green hydrogen. People keep saying that, but that's not really the point. If we really need to address net zero, and if blue hydrogen is the way to industrially decarbonise, then go for it. But don't expect it to disappear in 5 years' time. If you run blue hydrogen, it's got to be there for 50 years. You know, it's an expensive technology, and it's got to be done for its own sake. And if it's done properly, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. I'm just a little bit nervous. Been around too long to see too many corners cut, so it really needs to be enforced properly. Also, globally we're focusing very much on hydrogen at scale at present, and it's meaning it's difficult to support early hydrogen rollouts. Things like buses and trains and bin lorries. It becomes very hard to get green hydrogen. All the developers of electrolyzers are now making massive gigawatt scale systems, and we're actually gone back in the last 3 years in terms of getting those supplies in terms of cost. I think it would be really important that the government could re-incentivise this. And it's actually somewhere in the UK could steal in March. To get hydrogen out there, I would strongly advocate incorporation of hydrogen and biogas into a green gas grid, like they're doing in Bristol at the moment. Getting hydrogen into people's houses is something we should be familiar with. Nobody minded having coal gas 50 years ago, and the hydrogen wasn't the problem. It was 50% carbon monoxide. I mean, hydrogen is great. Carbon monoxide, 50% that's why people gas themselves in gas ovens. So it's not hard to get the message across if you point out to people. A few punch cartoons probably still not quite already moved on. I mean, putting hydrogen into the gas grid from renewables could relieve constraint payments. Billions gone into constraint payments in Scotland in the last few years. That's to turn windmills off because we can't use the electricity. But of course, we don't have electrolyzers to convert that either. So we can see what's needed and where it should be, but how do we get there? It's really important to support hydrogen, and I would urge that we support future technology in particular. Look at the US Earthship 1 project. They're targeting 1 kilogram of hydrogen for $1 by 2030. Really ambitious. We can now buy hydrogen at 30 pounds a kilogram, is what we were offered recently for a demonstration in Glasgow. It's gone up for obvious reasons, like everything else has gone up. But we could really do that. I was in a meeting in Denmark, and the investment community was urging supporting early TRLs. It costs a lot less to get the next technologies out than it does to do the demonstrations. There's a lot of leverage in industry, and the Danes were feeling as though hydrogen was already economically viable. So obviously CCS is not easy to support from industry. You need government support. But getting a little bit back into research, we've lost a lot in the last 5 years. There are initiatives now coming on, but we don't really support hydrogen research in this country today. The promise that we'll do it next year, but it's really important in the way we support battery development. On economic value, these technologies score really well with the fossil economy. But if you do input-output analysis, that they create a lot of jobs. And the best value is in transport, chemicals, then power, and lastly heat. But you need to address all these. And heat is really good because it takes any extra hydrogen you have over and you can use it there. And in the last week or two, like everybody else, I've been thinking about why is electricity so expensive? And it's the last bit of electricity supply that's really driving the cost of it. Most of it's quite cheap, renewables. And we spend all our time developing batteries and hydrogen for the base electrical supply. Electrochemical technologies are really responsive. If you've driven an electric vehicle, you know the acceleration is far better than an internal combustion engine. So we in the academic community and the rest should probably be thinking much more about responsiveness rather than how many percent of can we supply, but there's a real value to be addressed in getting that quick response.
Great, thank you. So that's talking a bit about the different types of hydrogen, the need to make sure that, if we are not going straight to green hydrogen, using blue or grey hydrogen, they need to do it properly to prevent any leakage, and just sort of the scale of the problem and sort of the problems we face and that we do have to overcome. And finally, I'd like to pass it over to Tony to round out the speeches.
Super, thank you. Thanks to Bright Blue for putting on this very cosy, warm event. So we're doing all right here. And now Cadent is the largest of the gas distribution networks. For those of you who don't know, we serve around 11 million customers, including people in Birmingham. So I guess the height is having gas supplied by Cadent. I joined the gas sector about 2.5 years ago from Severn Trent, who's the local water utility here. Just, I think, when gas was becoming an exciting place to work, because it really is at the front end of trying to decarbonise a sector. And as somebody who's passionate about the environment, it's great to go to a company where you can make a meaningful difference to achieving net zero. And not long after I joined, we came up with a new purpose for Cadent, which was around keeping people warm while protecting the planet. So not only our engineers like to get out there and make sure people are kept on their gas, kept safe, kept warm, but also as a company we need to be conscious of our role in protecting the planet going forward. A bit like Zoe, I want to focus my discussion next 2 or 3 minutes on hydrogen and heating. I don't want to be too evangelical around it. You know, we have this perpetual debate around heat pumps versus hydrogen, and I think we need to get away from that. Why? I think because if anyone's got a crystal ball that can look out 30 years and say the answer is this, then frankly they're kidding you. The economics, the physics, the chemistry is hugely complicated in this area, and the different energy vectors have very different properties, and they are almost certainly complementary to each other, and so the solution is going to involve a multi-energy vector solution. For those of you who haven't seen it yet, I haven't seen it myself, I've just gone in this morning. I'd go to the hydrogen zone, you'll see a really great example of hydrogen in transport there with the right bus. And as colleagues have said, you know, I think there's broad acceptance now of the role of hydrogen in things like heavy transportation, in industry, in power, and as John said, it's that kind of order that you look at. But we haven't really got that acceptance yet in heating and the role of hydrogen there. And I find that a little bit puzzling. I know there's an awful lot of work to do to get us in the position where it is accepted, but I actually can't foresee a circumstance where 22 million people today who are on gas boilers are all going to switch from gas onto an electrified system over the next 10, 15, 20 years. A lot of homes, frankly, are just not suitable to have a heat pump installed. And yes, there is absolutely spot on that we need to focus on proper insulation of homes and potentially get more homes in the place where you can have heat pumps. I think heat pumps are fantastic technology, you know, they've got great efficiency properties and will almost certainly be a technology that is rolled out to a good number of houses in the UK. The issue is, well, how many and how many will be on other things. Hydrogen's advantage is switching to a hydrogen-ready boiler for a home is pretty simple. There are hydrogen-ready boilers that could go into production fairly soon, and you can see an example of one in the hydrogen zone. And we switch out 1.6 million gas boilers every year. It'll probably come down this year because people will not be investing in their heating systems, but that in a normal state of play gives you a huge boost to be able to get hydrogen-ready boilers in there. The other thing that people talk about with heat pumps is the cost. Since the new government grants came in, the average cost reported is around £13,000 for a new air source heat pump in your home. The average saving in the UK is less than £10,000 per household. So put that into context. Who is going to pay for that? Three other, I think, advantages of hydrogen. We've already touched on this. Clare has talked very well about this. Resilience. You know, we are going to need 50, 100 gigawatts of offshore wind and solar. We're going to have a huge electrification with EVs and heat pumps and the like. But what do we do when we have these so-called Dunkelflaute events? Dunkelflaute is a German word that describes these grey, miserable days when the wind is not blowing. Where are you going to get your power from? Batteries serve the day's peak, but who's going to serve the peak days? And that's where gas, I think, comes in, and Clare has talked about that. As I said, I don't think it's well enough understood or explained how these different energy vectors work, and hydrogen in heating will also be able to help dampen the effect that huge peak demand has when it's cold outside on the requirements for that renewable energy. You know, we use something like 9 times more power on peak days than we do on normal days. I think the third advantage of hydrogen is, you know, and colleagues have talked about, is the economic growth opportunity. Clare already mentioned it. The hydrogen economy could be as big as today's power sector. Standing that sector up is going to be hugely challenging, but hugely impressive for the UK economy. Fourth, and this takes me on from that, is massive play that hydrogen has in terms of levelling up. Where is it going to occur? It's going to occur in the industrial heartlands in the northwest and the northeast to start with, and we roll out from there. It's going to create new jobs, but importantly, it's going to protect those jobs that currently exist in cement manufacturing and glass manufacturing. All of those types of jobs are reliant, I think, on hydrogen being the source of energy. Just to wrap up, I think hydrogen is already happening. Andy talks about HyNet in the northwest, which is the leading kind of industrial cluster, and Andy's been a great champion for that. We've also got an East Coast cluster. We've got one called Hydrogen Valley, which is the Midlands-based cluster that we're working on, which will bring hydrogen into the Midlands and capital hydrogen for London. We've got blending in the northeast already happening. The village there having 20% of their gas provided by hydrogen, the 80% coming from natural gas. And we're hoping to have the first hydrogen village demonstration where we can convert everybody in the village over to hydrogen in a couple of years' time, and that's in Whitby and Ellesmere Port. But part of the question was what more can be done by government, and I think there are probably three asks from me. First, a mandate for hydrogen-ready boilers. That's the way of kick-starting hydrogen in heating. The second is to allow for blending in the network. Not ubiquitously, I understand the concerns about letting hydrogen everywhere, but where people are producing it, and it's the producers who want hydrogen blending, then when they're producing too much, let's blend it into the gas network for domestic customers. And the third, and this sounds a bit wishy-washy in some ways, let's have a good stare at our institutional framework, our regulatory framework, because if we're going to get the investment into the hydrogen sector, we need to make sure that we're not tripping over ourselves with lots of decisions that are supposed to be encouraging this sector to stand up, but might have the opposite effect. I think we're going to need gas in the future, and that gas is going to be hydrogen. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Quite a lot in that speech, so I won't run through it all, but again, touching on some of the advantages of hydrogen, how it ties in with sort of other government agendas like levelling up, and the need for a blend of different solutions. Like, it's not all going to be heat pumps, it's not all going to be hydrogen, and we will need to work out, you know, which and where to target each of those different solutions. So now we're going to open it up to a Q&A. When you do ask your question, there will be a microphone going round. Could you just please wait for the microphone to make sure it's on the live stream? And then before you ask your question, if you could say your name and where you're from, that would be really great. So I'll start with this gentleman here and then the gentleman next to him.
Thanks. Hey, that was really interesting. I mean, I came here to test the hypothesis and to ask a question about types of hydrogen. A lot of the presentations so far have kind of underpinned the hypothesis, I think, which is, it seems like heavy transportation is a no-brainer. There's been this kind of silver bullet put out by the last government of heat pumps, but we all know that this is not the answer on its own. Obviously, insulation will change that slightly, but it just seems obvious that we have a gas grid, we have boilers ready to go. I mean, and we have a conversion cycle. Why are we not using it? That seems to me also to be kind of self-evident. What I'm interested in is, and I'm looking at this simplistically, right? So I didn't know about purple, but I look at grey and blue, and I think, well, this is converting carbon fuels into a new fuel. That doesn't seem like a good way to go. And then I look at, so isn't the answer green? Now, Saudi Aramco is making a big investment in green, and it's pretty obvious that the deserts of the world would be the good places to make hydrogen through solar power. But then we have transportation costs associated with that, and we also have the potential that we swap one energy insecurity for another in dependency on them. So can we talk a bit more about the types of hydrogen and kind of how to manage that carbon element against the energy security issues?
Great, thank you. What was your name, sir?
Oh, sorry, Jeremy Hopper. I'm from Lewis. I'm a constituent.
Great, thank you. And then the gentleman next to, I think, also had a question.
Thanks. My name's Jamie. I'm from MCS Charitable Foundation, so we work on decarbonising homes' heated energy. I want to ask a question about the costs of hydrogen for home heating. Zoe touched on that. Some of you may have seen last week a report from Cornwall Insight, energy industry experts saying that hydrogen for home heating is just economically not viable. And there's various reasons for that. One is the production cost, one is the fact that it's 3 times lower calorific value than gas, so you have to burn a lot more of it to get the same heat. There was similar research earlier in the year from Imperial College in London. Last week there was also a report from Jan Rosnov at RAP saying that a review of all the academic literature available on hydrogen for home heating that found, again, the same finding, that it's not viable for home heating. So I want to just sort of raise that question of how do you respond to that? Because obviously we've got people here saying that it is an option, and yet the academic literature and energy experts are saying it is not viable for home heating. And to answer the point about what we do with homes that can't have heat pumps installed, Energy Systems Catapult have looked at that, and they say that all home types are suitable. Obviously there is a need for energy efficiency, but it is possible to do that, and when you look at what other European countries are doing, they are installing heat pumps en masse.
Great, thank you. Claire, do you want to answer that?
I mean, I can answer either of those questions. I guess maybe we'll take Jeremy's first, and then I'll touch on Jamie's, but I think there'll be others who will have some thoughts on that as well. So in terms of the production routes for hydrogen, I mean, there are a number. I mean, the whole colour spectrum of the rainbow, we can talk about hydrogen, but I think in many ways it's important to stop talking necessarily so much about the sort of colours and more around what it is we want to achieve with these production routes. And I think one of the really important things that has been developed over the last 12, 24 months in the UK is a low carbon hydrogen standard, which to John's very good point means that actually we can't do CCUS enabled hydrogen badly in the UK because it won't meet the carbon standard. So we have that's been sort of developed with sort of industry and government, and it will ensure that we can be confident that every molecule of hydrogen that comes into our energy system that is supported by sort of public subsidy is genuinely low carbon. So that's hugely, hugely important. Sorry? Well, that's what we're shooting for. And I think, I mean, the sort of thinking is that hydrogen is kind of a little bit where offshore wind was 10 years ago, in that it has to, at the moment it is expensive, and I guess that comes to Jamie's point, at the moment hydrogen is expensive. But offshore wind was very expensive 10 years ago, and what we've seen is this huge cost down curve, and the same is possible and will happen in hydrogen, not just through investment in the UK, but also the absolutely insane levels of investment that are happening globally in hydrogen production. We will see hydrogen come down that cost curve to the point where it is affordable, both for industries and transport, but also for hydrogen heat. And I guess to sort of Jamie's point, there's a lot of academic literature out there that's looking at the future costs of hydrogen in heat, and there's a lot of debate in that area, and I think there is a lot of uncertainty around what costs we will be able to get to. For every report that we can have that says it's unviable, we can find one that says that it is. So there is a little bit of uncertainty there at the moment. And I think I have confidence. You know, if you'd said what cost we could get offshore wind to 10 years ago, everyone would have laughed you out of the room, and yet here we are. And so I personally, I choose to be optimistic, and I choose to be confident that as industry we can deliver those numbers. So yeah, I'm sure Tony and John will have some things to say about costs.
I'm actually going to go to Andy
yes,
to see your response, then sort of open up to this.
Look, I think there's a constant debate and discussion about colours of hydrogen, and I think, you know, the point Claire makes around the low carbon standard, that's the bit that I've got in my mind that is really fundamental to this. The government have recognised that. And I think, you know, to add again to Claire's point, you know, we have a long way to go on getting the costs right on this. You know, if you look at some of the other renewable areas, I think, you know, I remember some conversations taking place a few years back that we will never get to where we've got. We're there. We've got there. You know, it requires the oomph of not just this government but global governments to move us in that direction. And you know, we cannot think about the challenges that we're facing on our own. We've got to be working with countries all around the globe to achieve this. And that's why, you know, what's happening in America, what's happening in Saudi, that's good. All these things are very helpful. What we've got to try and do is maintain our lead in some of these areas so that we can capture the benefits for GB PLC as well.
Well, thank you. And then Tony, I'll go to you before I open up to some more questions for you.
Yeah, I think Claire answered the question. I mean, one of my real frustrations is bits of work like the Cornwall Insight thing, very partial. You know, you guys paid for it. What do you expect them to say? You know, so it's like, you know, the problem with this is we're trying to have these debates where we pick off a technology, we argue for it. Claire's answer, we expect the cost of hydrogen to come down. If you put that into the model, you get a very different answer. I love the theory. I absolutely love the theory. Every household could have a heat pump. Great. You know, how the hell are you going to persuade 22 million people in this country to have a heat pump, which costs somewhere between £10,000 and £15,000. I can't see it. I would not pin all of my things on one thing. I am not against heat pumps. I think, as I said, they're a terrific technology. We're going to need a blend of technologies to solve domestic heating in this country. And the steps we need to take in terms of insulation are going to be huge and very tricky to crack in the first instance. And let's not underestimate the practicality of things. I'm an economist. I pride myself on trying to be practical rather than theoretical.
Sure, John, you wanted to add?
Yeah,
before
I'd
we
like
wrap
to
up?
turn the argument around a little bit. I mean, one of the issues with hydrogen, as you say, one of them is storage. You have to convert it into ammonia to move from Saudi Arabia or synthetic fuels. But you've got this massive great energy store all through the UK. There's this gas grid.
Yeah.
And at a meeting in the US, people said, you know, if you want to do electrolysis, the real key thing is how much it costs for the electricity to produce the hydrogen. So I contacted Scottish Power and asked them how much. They give me a figure, and they were smarting on how much constraint payments they had. So they didn't answer me, but clearly it was a negative cost. So you can actually get cheap hydrogen into the grid quite quickly. And any sort of any methane molecule you replace with hydrogen saves carbon. And it's a long time before we're going to get 10% of the gas grid with hydrogen. It's an awful lot of energy. And yeah, it's a really good low-hanging fruit.
Not following. You said it's a long time before we can get to 10%. Because I'm interested in
The gas grid is a massive amount of energy. Compared the biggest energy store we have in the UK by a long, long way is the gas grid. Yeah. And if we can fill that, 10%, 20% with hydrogen, that will take the electrolyzer business and when CCS gets installed and you've got excess gas from industry, it will take all that hydrogen for a long time, and you can save carbon immediately. It's a wonderful store.
Can I just respond? Having been pleased to be impartial.
Sure, so we'll come back at the end for another questions, and we'll have the room for 15 minutes, but I'm just going to open up to the rest of the floor, if that's okay.
Sorry, I didn't actually catch your name. To speak to Cornwall Insight and actually ask them that question directly. Also ask other independent researchers. When we look at what's happening with hydrogen for home heating around the world, the UK is the only country that is looking at hydrogen for home heating. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's not viable. Because it's extremely inefficient compared to electrification of heat and heat networks. So there are other options that we should be looking at.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to open up to the rest of the panel. There's a question down here at the front, and the gentleman just in the back there as well.
Hi, good morning. Trevor Hutchings from GemServe. I'm going to leave to one side the argument around home heating, but I just wonder whether there would be a similar argument around the role of hydrogen in battery electric vehicles, and are we going to see a similar debate there?
Great, thank you. And I think it was the gentleman just in this back corner here.
So my name's... Okay.
I think so, yeah.
So my name's David Cairns. I'm from Equinor, Norwegian energy company. So we're involved in the East Coast cluster, investing in the Humber, and we have a hydrogen project due for final investment decision in about 18 months, which is blue hydrogen, and then we're building Doggerbank wind farm with SSE, which in due course will be green hydrogen into that same network. Two questions, if I may.
Yeah.
Just on public perceptions, am I right to say that actually for all those industrial uses, most of the public won't really know and won't really care because it's behind all those pine trees that you talked about? And then secondly, on this role of using hydrogen in the gas grid for storage, and one of the arguments we're making to government is actually they need to have a storage system for hydrogen to have a sort of reserve to be able to draw down for uses as you need it. Is that also right from your eyes? Thanks.
Great. I'll go to you first, Zoe, about the sort of public perceptions of the use of hydrogen. Have you heard anything? Or
I think the truth is that people don't really know very much, if anything, about hydrogen. So when we've done research with consumers, we've had to kind of put it to them, and this is what it would mean. So in industry, I think you're right. They probably don't really care. That might be different in areas where they rely on heavy industry for their jobs. They might be much more invested and much more interested. But certainly, at the day-to-day level in households, I don't think it's something people really think about.
sure, Andy, anything to add to?
I agree. Look, I was an interested observer. I didn't know anything about it, and I didn't know what was going on there. It's only when you get in there and understand the opportunity that industry is taking that you realise the potential that I think hydrogen has in those spaces. And I think, having spent all my time in business coming into politics, business on the whole tends to know roughly where things are. If it's not going to work, they're not going to put millions and millions and millions into doing something. If it's not the right thing, yeah, okay, we'll do some research, we'll work it through. But I'm seeing business, heavy industry after heavy industry, saying, actually, we really want hydrogen. We want this to work. We want to move forward with this. They wouldn't be doing that. Global companies wouldn't be doing that if they don't have some commitment to it. I think the issue around car batteries and hydrogen, I think that is interesting. I hear lots of conversations with HGV manufacturers around the whole sort of hydrogen area. I had the pleasure of having a hydrogen car for a couple of hours, and the first message I was told is don't go too far because there's nowhere to fill up. And we don't have the network available at the moment to do anything with that. I mean, they drove over from Yorkshire to Cheshire, and they were worried about getting back. That's the sort of thing we've got to be very aware of as well. The infrastructure that sits behind that's got to be there as well. So there's a long way to go forward with that. But I think there's an interesting conversation there.
Tony, do you want to do that? So you're not along. I'm just going to ask if you could lean in slightly. Sorry, I don't think they're speakers actually.
I won't say that. I think the transport area is interesting because in some sense, yes, I think it is a bit of a no-brainer for heavy transport that that batteries are not going to work in the way that hydrogen works. For domestic vehicles, I think it's really interesting. You've kind of got a global race. You've got people like Hyundai and Toyota investing in hydrogen vehicles, and others going the other way. And it's a bit like the heating thing without trying to conflate things. You've got to let these things unravel themselves to see what the right answer will be. And it may be different answers in different jurisdictions, and we may have hydrogen cars, and you're spot on. We need the infrastructure there to supply hydrogen into the vehicles. But you may see different solutions across the globe, I think, in terms of what the ultimate technology is.
Okay, thank you. And Claire, you wanted to?
Yeah, just three very brief things. To David's point around hydrogen storage, absolutely. The hydrogen is a puzzle. There's three kind of parts to it. There's the production, there's the storage and network infrastructure, and then there's the demand side. And I think probably we haven't focused enough on that sort of middle section at the moment around how do we solve that hydrogen storage piece, and we need all of those things to come forwards together. So it's important that we don't just focus on one and forget the others. So absolutely, hydrogen storage is something we need to be thinking about. To the other point around perception, I mean, I don't have any surveys or studies like Zoe does, but I think we are seeing a sort of rise in social consciousness, particularly for sort of young people, and I think there will be an increasing awareness in the sort of carbon content of the products that people are buying, and that is something that people are starting to think about more. And so if we're starting to potentially make some more of that information available, then that might sort of follow through from some of these industrial decarbonisation pieces. Question mark. I don't actually. That's not based on anything. That's just some observations. And then I guess also to sort of echo a little bit what Tony was saying to Trevor's point around transport. My hope is that the infrastructure will sort of build up based on some of those heavier duty vehicles. So, and an example is the station here in Birmingham, which has been put in primarily for buses, which are large vehicles which use a lot of hydrogen, makes the station very reliable. It's wonderful. But they've also put a car refuelling station on the side, which is where I refuel my hydrogen car. I do agree with Andy. There's certain places in the UK you can't take it to yet, but it's a great vehicle to use. I get nearly 400 miles out of it in terms of range, which means I can get to a lot of places. Don't have to refuel it that often. Only takes sort of 5 minutes to refuel. Works very much like a sort of petrol diesel car, but with sort of zero emissions. So it is a great technology, and my hope is that if we can start to get those refueling stations up for those other sort of heavier industries, then we give people a choice. You can have a battery electric vehicle, or you can have a hydrogen vehicle, whatever sort of works for you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to open up some more questions. Yes, the gentleman here, and then the gentleman in the front over here.
Thanks very much. Angus Hill from WA Communications. Obviously, you will talk about, for domestic heating, having a mix between hydrogen and heat pumps. Roughly, what do you think that mix would look like if you were to get into specifics? And secondly, does the viability, economic and commercial viability of the heavy transport, heavy industry use for hydrogen depend on having a certain amount of the domestic homes on hydrogen, or can that economy work without?
Great, thank you. And then just this gentleman here. So the microphone is making its way.
Hi, thank you.
I think it's working.
Mike Drury from Terrestrial Energy. You mentioned all the different colours of the spectrum of hydrogen. With reactors that are producing high heat, you can get the costs of hydrogen, and the costs were really important, he was saying, down to about $2 per kilogram, which is quite a competitive rate for the cost of hydrogen. What's your thoughts on that production using, more importantly, as you mentioned, low carbon production standard rather than colours of the spectrum? But also, if we do get the cost down, do you think that if we start looking at things like ammonia production that you mentioned for transport and distribution of hydrogen outside of the UK, that the UK could potentially become an exporter of hydrogen? Do you think that's a future that we might see?
John, do you want to answer those first? Either I think this is all Mike.
Certainly in terms of export, the north of Scotland, the offshore wind there is looking very much to export into Germany. And but you've got to transform the hydrogen into a more movable fuel. So it's got to be ammonia or methanol. And that, of course, can be used in shipping. So hydrogen is tricky to store. It's very good in many ways, but it doesn't form in a small enough volume. So you either have a big gas grid or you convert it into liquids to move distances. Just on the tension between battery vehicles and fuel cell vehicles, I've never seen a fuel cell vehicle yet that doesn't have a very good battery.
A little one, though. Compared to a battery electric vehicle.
Compared to a battery, yeah, but still it's a battery. These things should work together. They shouldn't be competing. And I think with larger vehicles, you're definitely moving to. It's got to be hydrogen, and if it's really large vehicles, you've got to have fuel, synthetic fuel, or it's just how far and how heavy you need to move.
Thank you. Did you want to come in and do it? So you never know.
I mean, I'm very nervous about getting into technical conversations about hydrogen. I'm a real fan of experts, and when we've got experts, let's let them answer the questions. But I mean, the most positive thing about this conference here today is we're having these conversations, and that we're having these debates. Because I think back sort of 5 or 6 years, and we weren't. So I think that from that perspective, I think that's really good.
Great. Zoe, Tony, do you have anything to sort of add on to that before I open up to the floor either?
On the mix of heat pumps versus hydrogen, I think that we do need clarity around that. Where does it make sense to have hydrogen boilers? Is that near the industrial hubs where they're doing hydrogen production? Does it need to be on the gas grid scale? Because, like, as everyone's alluded to, it's massive, and that would be a massive undertaking. I think talking around the costs, and I agree with Tony, it's really unhelpful when you have these two competing discussions around heat pumps and hydrogen. However, the gas networks have been equally as guilty of putting out that kind of content around heat pumps. So, and heat pump costs also equally will come down. So I think we need much more clarity about where it makes sense to have heat pumps and where it makes sense to have other technologies. Low carbon heat is locationally dependent. So what you don't do in high density areas, you wouldn't do off the current gas grid, for example.
Can I say a little bit?
Yeah, of course.
Can I say a little bit on exports? I think this is a real. I have these two sort of like two sides when it comes to exports. I have very mixed feelings about it. The first is that there is a huge export potential if we want to capitalise on hydrogen. Europe very recently, in response to some of the challenges that they're facing at the moment, doubled their hydrogen targets from 40 gigawatts to 80 gigawatts by 2030, recognising that 40 gigawatts worth they were going to be importing. So they very much have got their eyes on our offshore wind and our hydrogen, and there is a huge export potential if we want to capitalise on it. The other side of me sits here and thinks, we need a lot of hydrogen here. and is trying to balance those two things of, from an industrial perspective, absolutely, there's huge export potential, but we also need a lot of hydrogen here, so that's an interesting one. The second thing I just want to say on that is it's not just about the export of the molecule, it's also about the export opportunities for the tech and the skills. And that's definitely an area where I have no mixed feelings. And if we can develop a world-leading hydrogen industry, then there will be huge opportunities for export of technology and skills. So, yeah.
Yeah, Tony,
Yeah, I want to come back to your question. So it's a very challenging question. What's the answer? I think there's a point of it will vary from region to region, and a lot of work needs to go into local area planning. It's not a national one-size-fits-all. Analysis that we've done when you gives you a decent range on where hydrogen might be, and it's some broad figures somewhere between a third and 75%, and it's in that range, and that's the point. I don't know where in that range we will end up. It will depend on the price of hydrogen. It will depend on the ability to roll out heat pumps and get insulation in people's houses, and it will vary from town to town and region to region where the hydrogen is, the housing stock within a region, urban dense areas. I think much more likely with the type of housing that you've got that you're going to have hydrogen or heat networks as the solution. In rural areas, you're probably going to have more heat pumps where you haven't got a gas grid and where heat networks go. But like I say, it goes to Zoe's point. Area by area, you're going to have to work this thing through.
If we end up at 75%, Europe can't have any of our hydrogen.
That's the thing, yeah.
Could I add to Clare's point about exporting technology?
Could I ask you just to lean in, sorry, to the microphone?
Just to add to Clare's point about exporting technology, actually there's a huge danger that we end up importing technology, so we have to be very careful how we develop things. Look at what happened with wind. We could have beaten the Danes, but we didn't. Offshore wind, could have been building them in UK shipyards, but we didn't invest in the skills. We really need to get on top of that and get, use the hydrogen internally to develop our capabilities.
Great, thank you. So I think we have sort of 10-15 minutes left. So this is going to be final questions, then I'll ask for closing comments from the panelists. So is there any more questions from the audience? Yeah, the gentleman at the back, and then the gentleman just on the end here.
Hi, Steve Scrimshaw from Siemens Energy. I think you're all right. I think you need to do all of what you talked about to get to net zero by 2050, and I wouldn't pick technologies. I think you have to deliver on all of them. My concern, I think we were in a very leading position. We're at risk of becoming a follower. What would you say the one thing that government needs to do? This is all about growth, this conference. What would you say the one thing the government needs to do to accelerate, to become a leader again instead of a follower?
Great, and then the gentleman just on the end in front here again. Just no, here. Right behind you, yeah.
Yeah, it's just to my point about scale. I'm interested in maybe you could talk a bit more about will we have the capacity to produce hydrogen in this country to meet the potential need, and that links into really will we have the skills, will we have the technology to be self-sufficient.
Great, thank you. So I'll go to John first. So answering these questions or sort of closing thoughts, comments.
Yeah, coming from the university sector, we should obviously invest in research and development. But actually, that's hugely important. We've slipped right back. People came to us for the ideas a few years ago, and now Germany, Denmark, France, everybody is running ahead and getting that early stage of technology out there. We must be careful not to invest in large demonstrations that imports technology from outside, because we're just building our competitors that way.
Yeah, thank you. Claire, any sort of closing thoughts?
Yes, I'm trying to remember what the questions were. I should really write them down. So in terms of what scale is possible, we certainly have the offshore wind capacity to develop enough hydrogen to meet our energy demands. So it's not necessarily a sort of primary energy capacity issue. I think the skills. Sorry.
Won't the electrification of cars and all the rest of it, and the installation of heat pumps be competing for that capacity? I mean, we've got to deal with it all, right?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. But I think we still have the offshore wind capacity to meet the UK energy demand, whether it's electrification, whether it's via hydrogen. That's not really where the constraint is. So I think the skills piece I think is really interesting. Again, there's these two sides of it. Hydrogen will create huge number of jobs, but conversely, hydrogen will need a huge number of skilled workers. So I think we need to be starting to think about that now. How can we transition and industries that need to transition in those skills over? How can we be starting to make STEM subjects look really interesting and exciting to our young people and trying to sort of build that funnel for the future? So I think there's a few things that we can do there to ensure that we can deliver this at scale, because everyone's going to be after the same sorts of people when it comes to net zero. So I think we need to be looking at this holistically. And in terms of I have many asks of the government, and Hydrogen UK will be publishing our Hydrogen Accelerators document today, which has an itemised list of things that I would like. But I think one thing that I would just want to raise now is we have an energy bill that was going through Parliament and is now not going through Parliament. And I think that is a huge mistake. It's it's critical to getting these early stage projects off the ground. The last time we had an energy bill was 10 years ago, and it's absolutely imperative that we get that back on the table and moving through the House.
I had one follow-up question on sort of the follower. We were a leader and now we risk being a follower. And you mentioned sort of STEM subjects. Or just speaking from my own experience, a lot of the people I went to university with who did STEM degrees went straight into banking because that's where the much higher salaries are. Besides just offering more money in this sort of field, how else do you think we can actually keep the people with those skills, either who train here or train abroad, and track them here? What else can we do?
Well, I think delivering net zero, and there's an excitement there's an excitement around this industry. There can be an excitement around this industry about delivering net zero, about contributing to society beyond just moving people's money around. And I think we have to be selling the excitement of these kinds of areas and these kinds of energy technologies. So I think we need to sort of just drum up that and showcase what you can do in this area, and start talking to people all through that educational journey.
Great, thank you.
My employers won't appreciate me saying this, but it's not graduates you want. It's the engineers, the technicians, it's the fitters. That's what you really need. That's what Germany does. We need that sort of skill to generate. We can certainly lead from universities, but it's that core skill that is really important.
Thank you.
I mean, for me, this one of the reasons that I was so interested in this is it does fit with the levelling up agenda that the government were elected on. When Kwasi published the sort of blue book with the budget 10 days ago, or the budget that's not a budget, for me, opening up and seeing Cadent projects hydrogen focus in there was extremely positive. I think the other bit that the sector has got an opportunity with is the investment zones. And I think that's a huge, not just in terms of the sort of the focus that there will be in those areas, but the opportunities those areas bring and the chance to shape what happens in those investment zones. I think the point around skills, I think, is absolutely right. We as a country have not put the sufficient focus on technical education. And one of the best outcomes of sort of me as an MP engaging with this sector is my UTC in Warrington coming and saying to me, we want to engage with this sector. We've seen you talking about it. We think, so far, Warrington is a nuclear town as well. We work with Sellafield, and we do lots of things in that sector. They have all kinds of apprenticeships. Can we do some apprenticeships with the hydrogen sector? We want to get involved with that, and I think that is a massive opportunity. It's not graduate levels. It's young people, 18, coming out of T levels, coming through BTEC qualifications that can go into these sorts of areas and get a fantastically rewarding career. They don't have to travel to London to earn a lot of money. They can do it in Ellesmere Port, 20 minutes down the road from Warrington, and that for me is a huge opportunity as well. So it fits perfectly with the levelling up agenda. It addresses many of the energy issues that we face, and that's why I think government really need to get down and focus and work with the sector to really make this a reality.
I have another sort of follow-up question before I move on. So you mentioned investment zones, and a couple of years ago, sort of it was free ports, and before that, I think it was enterprise zones. What do you think specifically about investment zones and the recent sort of depiction of them? What does the government need to communicate to attract the young people or the people doing their T levels or the engineers or whoever to sort of focus on these new industries?
I think I'm very nervous about encouraging government to do too much. I'm a Tory. I don't like government doing very much. I'd rather business do it. But government have got to set out the framework of what the investments zones are all about. But then let business get on and be entrepreneurs and invest in those areas. The skills and the jobs will follow from business, not from necessarily from government. I think for me, clear down, give as much opportunity as possible for business to go in there and do the things they need to do.
Great, thank you. Moving on to say.
So I guess the one thing that I think government could do is
Can you speak up? Sorry.
We need a national communications around net zero. Why it's important, why we're doing this as a nation, and the support that government will give to people, to business, to industry to help us realise that vision. For us at Citizen Advice, that starts with a large-scale energy efficiency programme, because that will help us to get there. That will help us to have enough hydrogen, for example, on the system to be able to put heat pumps in people's homes. And I think that those things as well really speak to what Andy was just talking around getting businesses to do something. If they see this national campaign and it's serious and it's a direction of travel, then that will help them to make the right investments.
Yeah, thank you. And then finally, Tony, closing thoughts.
Yeah, no, we haven't talked much about investors, but there's a lot of money wanting to get into the UK to invest. I talk to our investors regularly. They want bankable projects. I made the point at the start about we need to have a good stare at institutional framework. We're not great at planning. We've got lots of regulation. Government takes the de facto decisions on things like hydrogen production, and I look forward to reading Clare's document on how we accelerate hydrogen. We've got to get hydrogen start to be produced, which means government intervention, like it or lump it, to enable that to happen. So I think that's the one big takeaway. Because if we don't get the production, all of this thing will become slightly academic, I think.
Great, thank you. So thank you everyone for attending this Bright Blue event in partnership with Cadent Gas. I think I'm letting you out 3 minutes early. Thank you all for coming so early. Thank you again to our panelists for showing up and speaking and sharing your insight. If any of you are interested in joining Bright Blue, we have a special conference discount, so you can join for only £10. Just speak to Max, who's sitting down at the back. And if you want to attend any of our other Bright Blue events, we did 32 events over the entire party conference, so I think there's about 10 left today. Our fringe guides should be in the tote bags that were on your seats. So we'd love to see you later, and thank you all again for coming.